I'm on the phone today, have some internet issues, but thanks everybody for connecting with us today. As I've been saying all along, the rationale behind these webinars was just to get everyone together and use this time to educate you guys and just connect during COVID. So thanks so much for joining us. I think it's been a really successful series. This is the final webinar session for us before we take a bit of a break for the summer. And then we will be interested in picking it up again in the fall, and potentially include some parent sessions as well. So if anyone has any ideas on content they'd like to see, speakers that they're interested in, please send us that feedback, and we'll definitely look to schedule some more in the fall. So as all of these webinars, if you've been a part of them before, this session will be about an hour, including some question and answers. So Duncan has you guys all muted. You can ask questions in the chat to him, or if you'd like to put your hand up, he can unmute you. Mel's okay with questions sort of on the fly. And as always, if you want coach credits for your attendance, if you could just type your name into the chat so we know you're in attendance. And if you are sharing your screen with anybody else, just add that other person's name. And we're gonna give one professional development credit for every 2 sessions you've attended. So after the session today with Mel, we'll sort of reconcile all the webinars and add that to the CSCF database so you guys can have your credits. So thanks for sticking with us through these webinars, guys. We really appreciate it. So today's presenter, Melissa Lacroix from the CSIO. She's a physiologist and works specifically with us at Alpine, Ontario, and our high performance teams. Melissa was a hockey player. I assume probably still does play hockey. And so that was her athletic career, and she began working in BC at the Canadian Sport Institute Pacific, or the CSIO in BC, or CSI in BC. And she was a physiologist there for 6 years. She worked with quite a few winter sports out there, including ski cross, Canada Freestyle, BC Alpine, and BC cross country teams. She's got a great background in winter sport. She's also been the lead physiologist for Wheelchair Rugby Canada since 2012. She joined the CSIO as a sport physiologist in 2018, and currently works with many national and provincial teams, including Wheelchair Rugby Canada, Beach Volleyball Canada, Canoe Kayak Ontario, Cross Country Ski Ontario, and Alpine Ontario. And she's been working with us specifically for the last 1.5 years, and she'll expand a little bit on what her role as our lead physiologist is all about in your presentation. And maybe Kip, if you want to add anything else before Mel takes it away in regard to any work she's been doing with us over the last 1.5 years, that'd be great. And then Mel could get started.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Robin. With regard to the work Mel does with us, yeah, she's a lead sports scientist and strength and conditioning coach. Designs all the programs, works very closely with the coaches even on a daily basis with monitoring and quarterbacks access to any sports science resources we may need, and does a terrific job. And then just specifically about what this presentation is about, it was labeled publicly as physical literacy and windows of trainability, which is a little bit right. But what we've been talking about is on snow, we've been identifying training priorities, technical and tactical priorities for certain age groups. And what we've been talking about is, besides the obvious, like developing energy systems, endurance, strength, power, what training competencies do we want to develop in our age groups so that when athletes arrive with a FIS team or with the provincial team, what core movements do we want them to be able to do? What things promote, symmetry and muscle balance, mobility, range of motion that also reduce injury prevention. And we sort of want to work on a physical curriculum. And I don't know if this is a full physical curriculum, but it's in that vein about what things do we want to develop in our ski racers over time. And so Mal has been working on that with us, and Thanks very much, Mel, for joining us, and I will turn my screen off. Take it away. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Kip. Thanks for the introduction. That was great. Yeah, so exactly like Kim mentioned, I've been working with the group on a lot of those areas of figuring out what some of the athletic competencies we want to see in the athletes as they come up into the program, and what are some of the injury related factors, risk factors kind of that are happening that we've seen in the last few years. So I'm going to try to accomplish quite a few things just in this small presentation here, just looking at so I'm going to try and go through some of the physical demands of alpine ski. So much of what you said, some of what are the energy system demands, the physical strengths and stuff like that, but relating it back to some of the common injuries we've seen within the group, both within the OST-SOD group that we've seen in the last few years, but also pulling from some of the research that we've seen at the elite national level as well. And then bringing that into some of those, the training demands and some of the competencies that we can work on from the young age groups up to the older age groups and national level that we want to see for those physical demands of the sport. And then finally, at the end, I'll talk a little bit about some of the risk management right now with the times being with COVID-19 and training and not knowing where everyone should go with this and returning to sports. So I'm going to touch on that just a little bit towards the end as well. So to jump right into it, I just want to kind of cover a little bit in terms of what the demands of alpine ski is to begin with. So I'm sure many of you guys have seen this or have a good understanding of this in terms of what the energy systems requirements are for your sport. Knowing that alpine ski really is in between that 1 minute to 2 minute zone of in a race type of setting, you're looking at that aerobic, kind of a mix between aerobic and anaerobic. So if you look at the graph on the right here, it kind of breaks down into the first 30 seconds versus second, and then the last kind of 30 seconds if you're going into a full 2 minutes, what that breakdown between anaerobic and aerobic is, right? So it's pretty obvious here that there is a good combination of both needed. So aerobic meaning you're looking at using oxygen as your fuel. So using oxygen and carbohydrates predominantly as your fuel during that time. So often people would refer to aerobic training as long endurance, high volume type of work and needing it for recovery. So a lot of people might not think of alpine as being an aerobic sport in general. However, it does need quite a bit in terms of the training that is being done. So training sessions on snow could last a few hours, and with that you will need some of that more aerobic work to aerobic system to get through those long training sessions, to get the reps you need to build those skills that you want in the athletes as well. On the anaerobic side, this is where you're using your energy system without oxygen. So using that anaerobic, that glycolysis system. So here is more in the higher kind of speeds, higher intensity work, where you would be doing high intense short intervals. So from 10 seconds to 2 minutes is when this system is really activated. And then finally is that last one here is your anaerobic, so your ATP CP system. So this system here really is activated and working within that 5 to 10 seconds. So it's quick burst of energy, but it does take a lot of time to regenerate that system as well. So having long breaks in between. So an example of this would be kind of in your start gates, having those starts, quick speed, quick bursts, having that speed efficiency. This is where you would be activating this system here and using it. So there should be some combination of these three systems within how we're training our athletes. Strength and power. So we all know, obviously, with alpine ski, there is a high demand of strength and power involved. A lot of that being needed for resisting those forces being generated, whether it's in the turns or maintaining some of that edge control and balance. So some of those components into building that strength and power is you'll hear a lot today we talk about this hamstring and quad ratio, right? So I'll get into that a little bit further, but having a good good balance between the strength between your quads and hamstrings is important. The hip abductor strength, so glutes, so that posterior chain again, is very important for a lot of the sport demands. Quadricep strength balance, so having a good balance between there's 2 or 3 main muscles in the kind of the quads that you'd be focusing on, but having a good balance on the what's called their vastus medialis and vastus lateralis. So having that balance between both, because sometimes you can get athletes who are focusing on certain movements all the time and have overdeveloped lateral versus medial, and that can increase some injury risk as well. Core strength is extremely important in a lot of ways, and we'll get into that as well. Power and speed, and I've touched a little bit on balance and stability for the sport as well. So those are kind of the main things, and I just wanted to go through now how we relate our testing protocol. So whether it's at Alpine Ontario and even with Alpine Canada, some of the testing protocols, if you actually take a look at them and understand what we're trying to achieve in those tests, a lot of times you'll see that it's all of the components that we're trying to target in our training as well. So first off, what we do with Alpine Ontario, with the Ontario ski team and SOD, is at the beginning of the season, so coming soon, what we would be doing is a movement screen, so looking at the athlete's ability to move. So where do we see some weakness? Is there any type of asymmetries between the right and the left leg? Is there a weakness in their core or glutes, as I mentioned before? So going through and being able to check on all of those different movements so that we can include those types of things in the program to address them. The broad jump and penta jump. So with this, we're obviously looking at testing power and strength. However, this really is focusing on the athlete's ability to jump and land, right, and produce that power moving forward. However, if you take an athlete at a younger age or older, if we focus on training their jump and landing mechanics, we actually are going to improve their broad jump and penta jump. In that, you're going to be improving their strength and power. So again, in the talk today, I'm going to focus a lot on this jumping and landing mechanics, but this is one way of measuring that. But if we improve those mechanics, and then you'll see you should be able to see some pretty big improvements there as they grow and improve. Counter movement jump. So the other one we do, at least in terms of OST and SOD group, we would bring them in and do some counter movement jump, which is on a force plate, and the national group does this quite a bit as well, with the force plates being able to see what legs they're jumping from or landing from more. So being able to see what the asymmetries are and what their landing mechanics are from a right and left perspective. This can be done without that type of instruments as well. So even if you don't have the equipment to be doing those power or force measurements, counter movement jump can still be done. And whether you're doing one leg or 2 legs, by whether it's you put something on the wall and have them touch it, you can still work and look at power through those. Hex jump, so looking at agility and speed, and those would be components to a training program. Box jump, looking at, so this would be whether it's your 60-second or 90-second. Here we're really focusing, because it's within that 60 to 90 seconds, we're looking at, in the first, usually you count each kind of segment throughout the box jump, and here you're looking at that anaerobic capacity with that test, and then the beep test, obviously your aerobic capacity. So as I mentioned before, in terms of what the physical demands are, you can see these tests and why they're being used and how we'll actually apply them within our training competencies as well. So I want to touch a little bit in terms of trainability of the athletes and within their growth period. So, Kip mentioned this briefly in his introduction. And so I did want to, I'm not sure on the call, even if you want to type in the chat group, just in terms of what age group you are working with as I go through this, because I will touch on kind of different age groups and different ages of trainability and how we can measure this peak height velocity. So feel free to throw in that chat group just what age group you're working with predominantly, and I can try and touch on that as I go through this. But so there are some different phases with that growth spurt. So knowing that athletes, both males and females, have a different kind of growth spurts, different times, different ages. You'll see there's this onset of that growth spurt. So in this bell curve, you see there's the onset, there's the period where it accelerates very quickly, and then there's what we call that peak height velocity. And then once it hits that peak, it usually starts to obviously come down and level out to a certain degree in terms of the changes of how quickly they're growing. So I'll touch on that in here. Looks like we have a wide range from U16 to U10 to U14, so that's great. So in this graph here, you'll see kind of some of those difference between females and males. So on this bottom here, you can see the age group, so 5 to 20 in terms of the development age, and then some of the different components to training. So you have your supplements, which would be your flexibility, mobility work, speed, so your agility type of stuff, skill work, stamina, speed 2 being kind of that anaerobic, that quick power bursts of speed that I mentioned at the beginning, and then our strength phases, right? So if you look at a male versus the female, males are often going to hit that peak height in around, and this obviously is different for every person. So this is where I'm going to show you how to measure this if you're within this age group. Working with this age group is knowing when this is occurring for the athlete, because there is these windows of trainability that is really important in terms of being able to hit those during that time. So one of those areas is on this graph is called the stamina, which is your energy system development. So that aerobic, anaerobic work. When your athlete's in that peak height or that growth spurt time, so where that period where, I'm not sure if you guys can actually see my mouse or not, but where they start to increase and then hit that peak and then come back down. So in that curve, that time, that is where there's a really key period to train that system there that you'll never get back to a certain degree, right? So obviously you're going to continue to train those systems as they grow and into their athletic careers, but this point in time, you can make a very big impact on those systems. So again, just you can see the difference between the males and females where that might happen a little bit sooner, obviously in the female and male. The other thing is in the strength. So you'll see with the strength, again, that might be a little bit different for females and males when that's occurring within their development age. So what that means is yes, you can develop strength at different periods of, I'm not just saying you can only develop strength here, but this is usually when you'll see some pretty big gains, significant gains during that development time. So what you'd be looking for essentially would be looking for measuring their height, their weight potentially, and their age. Your age, you'd be looking at age in months, however, not years. So taking into account the months that they are at that point and the velocity of that growth. So taking the age in month versus their height in centimeters and how quickly over time that change is happening. So I'll show you a graph in a few minutes to explain that a little bit further of what that might look like. But in some sports, it's actually wingspan and sitting height can make a difference. For Alpine, I'm not quite sure, but maybe wingspan with the start gate, maybe it makes an impact or difference in terms of that as well. But you can measure that in a similar way. So you would technically, if you wanted to look at this peak height velocity, what you would normally do is within those age group that I had mentioned earlier, when it might occur in around, for females, kind of at 11 to 15, 16, you would start to measure their height every 3 to 4 months here. So every 3 to 4 months, you would reassess their height in centimeters and then add their age in months at that point. And then just track over time. So again, if you see them in another 3 to 4 months, you do it again, whether the athletes track it themselves or you as coaches could do it at wherever as well. And what you're looking for is any unusual or really, really big changes in that the height velocity. I'm going to show you, this is what it would look like if you graphed it out in terms of the age. So here, kind of going from 120 to 200 months, and then in centimeters is that change in velocity, right? So you can see kind of in the first little bit, it goes, it's pretty level for a while. It goes down, up, kind of spikes here and there. But where you see that huge change is in and around that 170 months period here, right? So when you see that starts to go, okay, it's past that 4 centimeters mark. Okay, maybe they actually probably started that growth in around this period. And you can see it peaks here and then slowly comes back down in terms of the overall changes, right? So if we were to take this and look at where that kind of curve was in the previous slides, they would likely be in that kind of, that bell curve of that peak height velocity of that growth spurt. So this would be their window right here. As they start to peak is where you would want to start to really focus some of that, making sure that those athletes are essentially getting access to doing a lot of that aerobic, anaerobic speed type of work. So coming out of that, there's, with that, from that period, there's also some things that that we've seen within the OST group and in terms of their injuries. And some of this may be from some of those changes and growth spurts happening, is we've seen quite a few chronic injuries, at least on the male side of things, with patellar tendonitis. And they'd be in and around that age group where they're building a lot of strength very quickly. So some of those athletes, whether they're doing a lot of squatting or heavy kind of strength loading, and maybe not enough or not focusing enough on mobility work, is where we might see this patellar tendonitis. In and around that as well is jumping and landing volumes as well. So we have seen some of that in the group, is patellar tendonitis. A bit, we've seen this a bit at this age, but just in general with alpine ski, obviously we know the background between with knee injuries, ACL being a very high risk. And then low back pain is another one that we've seen. And this one comes down to a few different weaknesses that we've been able to identify, and that being whether athletes have difficulty with activating their glutes, so that posterior chain, glutes and hamstrings, and they're actually compensating when doing different movements with their back. So whether it's skiing or in the gym, they're not activating those glutes enough and using more of their back. So a lot of that pain comes from that, and or lack of core strength can be part of that as well. And then finally, there's obviously your being a high risk sport, a high adrenaline sport. These athletes, there are going to be some acute traumatic injuries as well, whether it's concussion related or any type of broken bones. We've seen quite a few of those as well. So that's the idea behind seeing some of these trends, is looking at how we can create a more robust athlete, both from the development age and into this to the higher groups and national groups. So what we've done is tried to implement some of these and include some of these accessory muscles and areas to work on. So one, we've identified that quad hamstring ratio. So there has been shown a weakness. We've done some testing just to see what their quad strength is versus their hamstring ratio, and there is quite there has been shown to be a difference there. So trying to include this more hamstring work in the programming. A glute core, so activating, like I mentioned before with the low back, is being able to activate those glutes and core properly. Mentioned earlier, but the left and right leg symmetry. So we have seen some difference within the left and right and how athletes are jumping and landing on different legs or using one leg more than the other. So trying to include, we should be including more of those symmetry type of bilateral and unilateral exercises in programming. Finally, you're looking at stability, obviously a huge component to programming as well. Kip, if you want to go ahead, you can jump in there.
Yeah, I just wanted to like on the quad hamstring ratio and right left leg, because there are guidelines after an ACL injury that athletes should be 85% hamstring to quad strength ratio, and some sports are really firm about that, and some of it's more of a guideline to guide returning to sport. But I just think it's interesting that we've done 3 years of prophylactic testing on that now, and I don't think we've seen anyone yet have that kind of balance. And some, well, not just some, but several athletes each year have like less than 50% hamstring to quad ratio, and that's including athletes that have done the test at least twice. So it's not just a learning curve or an opportunity to train. So I'm curious, I'm not sure if this is more of a question for the end, but like what can we do? And because it's definitely, it doesn't matter where they come, which club they came from, which program, who their trainer is, everybody has a pretty alarming ratio of hamstring to quad strength.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of seen across even as, like you said, at all ages, you've seen that. One thing I'll get into a little bit too is the difference between the sexes. So females do have a higher risk of this as well. So I think the biggest thing in your question there, Kip, is, which I'll touch on a bit later in the programming section here, but would be including a lot more hamstring work as accessory work on top of what we're doing. And it also comes down to how we're training landing and jumping mechanics. So I'll show you in a few slides here, just in and around how a lot of athletes come into the system or program that I've seen, different ages, are very quad dominant in how they jump. So being able to retrain and cue athletes to jump and land by activating hamstring and quad and not just quads is a big one. Jacques has his hand up too. Go ahead.
Yeah, Mel, just a question in regards to peak height velocity. And I know, a lot of times we're probably not the greatest at tracking that stuff, but we can generally see it, with our own eyes. But, we see a decrease in technique on the hill. My question is, in regards to functional movement, do you attribute the same thing to like alignment and that kind of thing during that period? The reason why I ask is because we tend to be in a region, I think, that does a lot of corrections with boot alignment, and I'm just wondering if are we taking that into consideration when we're looking at alignment during that stage?
Yeah, it's a good point, Jacques. I do think that's usually a time, like you said, that growth spurt happening. There's a lot of changes, whether it's in equipment and just functional movement. So you often see, like, before that time, their movements might look really good. However, when they kind of have that growth, it changes, right? So them not being able to get into a deep squat or anything like in terms of some of the core movements that you would normally see changes. And that's where in that period is being able to focus and change or help re-educate them in a way almost to in some of these core movement patterns.
Actually, so you're saying actually being quite deliberate in making sure that you're correcting maybe, you know, movement patterns that are tending to go, you know, a little bit in the wrong direction with that period.
Yeah, so I would say slowing things down. That's, I would say, even within like the group, it is often tough because athletes think they can progress with some of these movements. So for example, I'll take a jumping pattern. So maybe before that growth spurt happened, their jumping was good, mechanics were okay. So then they were able to kind of progress with some of the exercises. And then come that growth spurt happens and things have changed quite a bit. So almost taking a full step back and going back to the basics of re-educating those simple tasks, skills, and movements to go back to those basics.
Good, thanks.
And I'll get into that in a few minutes here as well with how we can progress or regress some of those things. So, I mean, you guys just touched on it a little bit in terms, I'm not going to get into these three factors too much because you guys know probably more than I do on this, but some things that can obviously be a risk factor for injuries is changing equipment like you guys both mentioned already. Speed, so at what speed you're training at, and then changes of snow conditions is a big one too in terms of how hard and what type of snow you guys are training on can affect some of the acute or chronic injuries. But what I want to get into now mostly and what I'll focus on is just the physical factors. So how fatigue can relate to some injuries, what strength. I touched on it a bit, but just on the sex and genetics piece of it, and then landing and jumping mechanics, and then overall training modes I'll get to in the end as well. So in terms of the landing mechanics and how it affects that risk factors is with any type of landing or jumping, any changing in directions, you're essentially putting yourself at a rapid, what's called eccentric, so shortening or elongating the muscles, but in a deacceleration phase. So very quick movements are happening during this, and that's often with those fast movements and deacceleration is where we see some injuries, and especially with the ACL knee type of injuries if we aren't doing and landing and jumping properly. Obviously, being a high risk sport, there's different type of movements in your sport, whether you're kind of landing awkwardly on one leg outside of your center of mass. So those different type of movements, if we don't have the proper strength and different ways for our bodies to absorb that, there's going to be some risk in there for injuries. Mentioned the hard snow, so any type of hard landing, whether it's on just jumping or on the snow, is a factor there as well. I started to kind of talk a little bit about it, but just the angle of which our knee is flexed. So when our knee is at a 0 to about 30 degrees, you're activating more quads than hamstring. And then again, if you're above 90-degree flexion in that knee, so more than 90 degree or below 30 degrees, we're really quad dominant in there. So when we're landing or jumping, let's say, so landing, if you're landing and your knees are below that kind of 30 degrees flexion, you're really only activating, for the most part, your quads. So there has been a ton of research there showing that there is increases of links to ACL injuries or ACL loading when we're doing a quad dominant type of jump or landing. And so that comes back to, like I've mentioned before, is just being able to teach the athletes how to jump and land properly to activate those hamstrings with the proper knee flexion. Females do have altered hamstring quad activation, which is going to reduce kind of that hamstring strength. So there is the higher risk with female athletes. So something to really focus on, especially at the younger ages, really trying to get them to include some of that hamstring work on a regular basis in the programming, on both sides, but especially on the female side. So with training competencies, I know I've touched on a few of them already, but some of the main things that I would look at from the youth and coming in as they go into their careers is looking at landing mechanics, jumping, so their ability to jump, and again, like I've mentioned, just what they're activating when they're doing these, because there's a lot of different ways that you can compensate when doing this. It might look okay, but they're actually not using the proper muscles and activations. And I'll show you again some videos in a few minutes here of what those could look like. But stability being a big one that should be included is the athlete's ability to stabilize on double legs, so 2 legs, and then on single legs, so progressing from double leg to single leg movements with their stability, and then going from there with increasing the progression into stable surface to non-stable surface to movement and different things. So I'll get into that a bit too in more detail, but another big one would be seeing the athletes, just their overall athleticism and coordination as they develop. So their sprinting and running techniques. So you'll often see some athletes who just really don't have that athleticism or they've gone through, like you said, Jack, that growth spurt, and now their sprinting mechanics are completely off, and you just see that their coordination isn't the same anymore. And so really focusing and bringing things back in, I would say sprinting and running would be similar into that landing and jumping mechanics to build full that overall athleticism and robustness of an athlete. Mobility and movement patterns. So this comes into that risk management. And so both risk management, but also strength, ability to, if an athlete does not have the right mobility patterns, then we could be increasing them. They're not going to be able to get into a full squat, let's say, then you're not going to be activating the right amount of muscles. You're not going to be able to get into the sport specific movements. So if we can get them at an early age to work on some of the mobility work, then you're getting ahead of the curve in terms of a lot of the movement patterns they're going to be able to do and learn. We talked already a lot about the quad hamstring imbalances, fitness. So their durability and training tolerance would be up there as well for those training competencies. And then I'll leave it to you guys on the ski specific skills and technique, but knowing that is a huge part of the sport as well. I'm not going to get into too much details in terms of the actual phases of trainings that we would include from a macro perspective, but just wanted to kind of highlight that at the beginning of any training program, doesn't matter what age, even at the national level, elite level, we always go back to focusing on the basics of the anatomical adaptation. So correcting any form that may have changed, any bad habits, any movement patterns of core, that should be the base of anything. And we don't move on from that phase until to develop more strength and power until those movements and everything is aligned. We're a little out of sync here, but so for what I do want to get into right now is just kind of a more details in what a couple different exercises that you could do in terms of progressing or regressing in the overall program. So what a warm-up should look like, what I mean by mobility and activation, neural activation, and then some of the different lifts and what those could include. So for a warm-up, generally like a warm-up for an overall strength day, but this could also relate back onto your on snow stuff, is doing some the warm-up itself off snow and or before a strength training program. There should be some dynamic component. So that is looking at increasing your heart rate, increasing blood flow. So doing some skips, whether it's a light jog, some skips, butt kicks, so all those types of movements. It should also include an activation piece. So this is activating some of the key muscle groups that I've mentioned already. So whether it's activating core, glutes, hamstring, different upper body muscles. So that's kind of just a few examples here would be doing a high plank, shoulder tap, bird dogs. Yeah, so a few things there with activation, and then you would get into some mobility work. So on the mobility side would be just some examples here on this would be looking at going into a high plank, into a Spider-Man, or a deep squat, doing some reaches, just really moving, doing some dynamic type of mobility work to get that movement and range of motion. And then you'd get into what we would call that motor control and neural activation. So that's where your jumping, your landing, and speed work would come in. So you want to really start, whether you're going on snow or strength, to activate kind of those neural patterns. And so from there, you can include a lot of your jumping and landing mechanic stuff at the beginning in your warm up. So you're training it, but also warming up. So what I always kind of have in here is a few different jumps. So here I have single leg, mini hop and stick, which I'll show a video actually in a few minutes of this, but and then some box drops where you're jumping from a box and landing and sticking it and working on control movements. So a few things there. And then you go into maybe some speed work. So whether it's some sprints, some jumping, or agility stuff in here for your speed work. I'm gonna throw this out to you guys just quickly, but just in terms of what are some common mistakes that we might see jumping and landing. So I'm gonna quickly go through and show you some pictures here. So up here in your top, I'm assuming you guys can see this in your top left corner. A big one we see, this one here, I have all these pictures just single leg, just to show kind of you can see a little bit more in single leg versus double leg, but that knee valgus coming in. So here, what's happening is he likely his torso is coming forward, leaning forward a little bit, and then not activating whether it's his core or glutes here, and that knee valgus is coming in. Over here at the bottom, you can see that this athlete here, again, there's a little bit less of that knee valgus, but he's compensating with his upper body by going to his left to try and stop him from going into that knee valgus here. If you go up to the top one, this is where I was talking to you earlier about the quad dominant landing. So if you look at this, his knee actually is taking most of the absorption here, but there's not much flexion in the hip, and he's moving his torso forward. So you can tell in this one here that he's actually mostly activating his quad and taking the impact here. So what we would try and do with this athlete is bring his chest up. So here you can see his chest is forward. He's actually leaning with his chest. So here you want to chest up, eyes up. And a good cue I would use for this is actually trying to land on in the middle of the foot. So a lot of times athletes will either land too far back on the foot or too far forward, which is going to make them lean forward a little bit too much. So if you can try and have them land in that middle, kind of on the ball of that foot, is where you want to kind of cue them to land, and then absorbing through the knee. So absorbing at the knee, but also absorbing at the hip is often something that gets forgotten or not done at that age, and that's when the more quad dominant landing happens. So just a few things there. So landing on the balls of the foot, trying to absorb in the knee, but also hinging at the hip. So flexion at the hip by sitting back a little bit and chest up. So here I'm just going to show you, but in terms of that work I was talking about in terms of stability and motor control. So first I would start with doing bilateral work and then going into unilateral, so deacceleration and landing. So hopefully these work. I can show you. This is where I would start with landing and controlling the movement first. So whether it's lateral or linear hops. and then you can progress them into single leg, but again, keeping it nice and controlled with the movement. From there, you can move into continuous, so going double leg or single leg continuous versus controlled in those. Some other movements here that we've used is doing what this is called a snap down movement. So again, showing just that you're going double leg to single leg, and you can progress it to doing vertical and then broad jumps. And these would kind of include some deacceleration, some jumping, and some of the landing work. And then the last one would be your single leg. So before adding any type of movement, whether it's power work or anything, I'd always start with that controlled movement. And I wouldn't move forward until they have that movement down. Just showing you some of the box jumps, or even including an easy way to make it sport specific is throw some poles, some half poles like she has in this video in your hands, doing some box drops. And you can see actually with hers is a really good view of how she's landing using that knee. There you go. So she's at about that 90 degrees, and then even at the hip, she's really absorbing through the hip and knee. Chest is up and deep into that hip hinge. And then this one here. So yeah, just a few different more sport specific movements that you can progress eventually into with both bilateral and unilateral. Core control, so working on core control, you can do some isometric stuff. So your planks, your, sorry about the music on that one. It's probably loud. Glute bridges are both isometric work. And then progressing into transverse work, which would be your Palloff press. So Palloff press being you're having some resistance from lateral side and just trying to resist that rotation from that lateral side. And then you have your rotation type of exercises as well that you could add in. In terms of that stability and motor control, going from stable to unstable surface, I know I talked about that a little bit, but an example of that would be going from lateral, so on a stable surface, and then in this second picture, you can see an athlete on stability or half stability balls there. But again, I would never really move them into those next stages of unstable until they've fully mastered the stable. Another part of that stability and motor control is doing some expected versus unexpected instability. So what that is like essentially doing any type of work that you're expecting to be off balance versus unexpected. So whether it's you're closing your eyes and doing something, or you're on like a slackline type of thing, or on a stability ball. So having some instability that you might not necessarily always expect should be implemented as well. Last thing on the stability work is just having you switching it up every now and again. If and once they get to a certain level of stability work, being able to progress from doing the stuff at a rested state versus a fatigue state. So if you have a stability type of workout that you're working on, maybe every once in a while, and I'm not saying go and crush them on the snow and then do some sort of stability work. No, because that you are gonna be at increased risk for injuries there. But if you're doing some sort of workout and then you want to, at the end of it, do a bit of stability work, is good to train in a fatigued state, because that's what's going to happen when you are on snow eventually, is being in a fatigue state. In terms of actually the strength training program, some of the training considerations to think about would be working on technique before adding any strength and load, obviously. Working on those mechanics of the movements first before adding anything. Developing your sport-specific range of motion. So knowing what range of motion you need to get in for your sport. So for skiing, how deep, how like those types of things for on snow, how deep into the squat you want to get them. Try to develop those different mechanisms in the program as well. I mentioned it already, but using both unilateral and bilateral, especially when you're lifting. So single leg and double leg exercises should be included in any type of strength workout as well. Lower body symmetry, so that is looking at that kind of right to left symmetry. So that's kind of being addressed in that unilateral exercises, but really focusing and trying to remind the athletes that you want to be training to be in a way ambidextrous. So training in a way that you could be just as strong on your right and left leg, right? And I've mentioned before how important that posterior chain is. So I'm just gonna run through some of the little lifts, primary lifts that we might look at doing. And again, I wouldn't necessarily put a bar under an athlete until we know that they can do a lot of the movements in terms of, for example, if it is a squat, I'm just gonna keep using that as an example, but let's say it is a squat, I wouldn't put them under a bar until I know they can get into the full range of motion, because we'd just be training bad habits and movement patterns if we do that. So these would be a few different ones that we might do is your hang clean, power cleans, your front squat or back squat, and then your deadlifts for primary movements. And then in your secondary movements is where you would focus more on your bilateral or your unilateral strength, and then some upper body and core work as well. So just a few movements down here that you can see working on that ski specific kind of work on that outside leg unilateral. So some things that, some exercise here would be kind of your step ups, split squats, rear foot elevated. A really good one is that depth, that single leg squat as well. So just a few things to focus on in those secondary lifts. And then this is where I would focus in terms of at the end of a session, after having worked on a lot of those main lifts, is what I call your assistant lifts. So this is where you might work on some of those imbalances that you found in the athletes early on, and some of those weaknesses we talked about. So those hamstring strength, the core strength, I would really hammer home some circuits on these main competencies here. So working on your hamstring curls, hip abduction, Pallof press as a exercise. This would be an example of 3 that I might choose. So that would be kind of a core workout, core strength. You have your hamstring curls, and then some abduction. So those glutes. I already mentioned a little bit about mobility, but in terms of, like I said, if you can't get into that sport-specific movement due to mobility or lack of flexibility, then it really is going to change an athlete's center of mass and their ability to land. So sometimes it might not actually be that they aren't activating the right muscles. It could be that they don't have the flexibility or mobility to get into that position. So really making sure that the athletes are working on these things. So sometimes I see with a squat, it's not actually the hamstrings or glutes, it's in the ankles. So working on ankle flexibility or mobility as well that could potentially increase risk injury or decrease performance if their mobility isn't up to speed. These are just kind of a review of everything we just went through. I'm gonna kind of jump ahead here just into the final piece. I know we're getting to the end, so I've already hammered home a lot of these things here. So that your competencies in strength development. So again, the hamstring quad ratio, a lot of the muscle imbalances that we would focus on here. The last thing here, just wanted to quickly touch on is fatigue. So how fatigue can actually increase our risk for injury. So there is quite a few research or articles showing that ski-related injuries can occur and do occur when you are in a more fatigued state. So like I mentioned early on, is being able to increase the athlete's fitness and robustness and durability as an athlete is really important to help with this injury prevention. And being able to train, like I said, in stability in different ways when you are fatigued can help as well. Risky biomechanics when you are fatigued, obviously increasing that risk of injury. And then the last thing here is there are injuries, or there are articles showing that there alterations in your hamstring and quad contraction. So that co-contraction between the two, it is affected in fatigue state. So again, that kind of puts them in an increased risk for injury. So what I want to kind of put out to you guys to think about is, how are you actually monitoring your athlete's fatigue? And so that's one thing that we've really focused on this year in this off season with Cam and Jacques and Kip with the OST and SOD group, is how are we actually monitoring how the athletes are feeling. So from a life emotional stress standpoint, physical stress, mental recovery, all those pieces, what are the athletes feeling, and how is that affecting how they're doing in terms of their actual training. So I'm going to show you just quickly, and this is pretty in depth in what we've done, but there's some very simple ways that all of you can do this without all the gadgets out there that we're actually using in our programming. So we have an online system that the athletes can go in and answer questions, and we get the data that spits out into a dashboard for us. So for example, an athlete would go in daily and answer some of those questions, and it would give us a status on how they're feeling with their, how recovered they're feeling versus what their workload is. But what I want to really focus on, even at the younger age for some of you guys, is really just getting to know your athletes. So here we have a graph just showing kind of the workload. So what the athletes are doing, whether it's their training, so how acute their workload is, and then how fatigued they are. So you can kind of see on this top one here, in the higher this black line is, means the higher their training loads are. You can see their fatigue levels are really low, which is that red line, and then come back up obviously when there's the training load comes back down. So really just focusing on the fact that there needs to be these up and down progressions with training loads, and understanding that on your own when you guys are programming, whether it's on snow training camps, knowing when and how the athletes are adjusting to that is really important, because everyone is very individual. So the biggest thing is ask your athletes questions. How are they feeling? Get to know them, and what things could be affecting them in their life. So this is an example here of an athlete where some of the questions we ask them, so how fatigued, how sore they are, how stressed, all of these questions, is how they're enjoying it. So mentally, are they even enjoying their training right now? Irritability and sleep would be up there in terms of for recovery. So you can see on this graph, the higher these numbers are, the more fatigued, the more kind of physical and mental stress they have. And so this is where we may look at this and say, oh, okay, this week was a pretty hard week of training. So yeah, you should see an athlete kind of reporting back that they're a bit more tired and whatnot. But you can use this to understand there might be a week where an athlete has a lot going on at home or in school that you might not know about. So just constantly asking questions to your athletes. So how do they feel? What are their motivation levels? Sleep hours and quality, especially in the younger population, I think is huge in terms of recovery, and is very underestimated on what that can do to performance. So really understanding athletes' sleep hours and quality, their fatigue and soreness levels. That kind of ties in nicely this last point in terms of COVID and returning to training. Within these times, I know there's it's really important to monitor how athletes are doing when you go back to training. and understanding what athletes are actually doing, not knowing a lot of, right now we don't have a ton of touch points with the athletes, let's say, if everyone's kind of remote. So just understanding what they're doing in terms of their strength training, what other sports and are they doing, are they mountain biking, all those types of things, and how that can affect their overall training load and fatigue. In terms of right now, I know the general recommendation has been to not necessarily train as much as you would because of COVID and just training at a high level can increase our risk and decrease our immunity for the athletes. However, this is where monitoring the athletes and what you guys are actually doing and prescribing for training is really important, because you have no idea if the athletes are feeling unhealthy or feeling fatigued. You could be putting them at risk and pushing their immune system down. So just understanding, giving them enough recovery breaks is important during this time, and being able to monitor how they're doing. The last thing would be risk-taking behavior. So we've chatted a lot in our group just in terms of what athletes are doing right now. They might be doing a lot of things that are fun for them, which is awesome to get them out there and doing things, but just being mindful of what behaviors and what sports they are taking up right now and where their skill levels are at. So some athletes might be, their skill levels might be pretty good in terms of mountain biking or any other sport, whether it's skateboarding, whatever it is. Others may not. However, their risk-taking behaviors are high, and therefore putting them at risk for those acute traumatic injuries. So keeping that in mind, having those conversations with the athletes of, hey, maybe take a step back from going all out on your mountain bike, because it will put them at risk of injury, especially if they're doing a lot of other training and they're going into these other sports fatigued. I know that was a lot, and so if there are any questions, I have a few minutes here. We can turn it over to you guys. I know there was a few in the chat room already, so I'll try to go through those and answer them. But if anyone else wants to jump in while I'm doing that, go ahead.
There was one, Mel, from Stuart that says, with the broad changes in U8 to U10, are there broad guidelines we can follow to increase physical literacy?
In U8 or U8? Yeah, U8.
U8 to U10.
Broad guidelines. I'm not sure, like with you guys in terms of your LTAD model, if you guys have already something set up through that of what the athletes can and should be able to do. Broad guidelines, I mean, that's kind of, I would go back to at that age, what can they do and what can you move into? So from that U8 to 10, what skills are you focusing on and movement patterns? I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and just kind of look at, what your LTAD looks at versus what physical kind of capacities would be for that age. So sorry, I probably haven't answered that fully, but I'll take a look at this question a bit more, maybe give you, whether it's Kip, I can send you some stuff after this, some guidelines for that.
Probably playing 3 or 4 different sports at that age.
Yeah.
Would be a good start.
Yeah, I think that's a general rule, at least from what I've seen, is having athletes involved in a lot of different, not a lot of different sports, but not just necessarily specializing in one area. Being able to try different things and having that full athleticism is key, I think, especially at that younger age. Just build their awareness and different skills. I have a few more here. There was a few questions kind of in just in and around, and maybe I can, whether time-wise here, I can address them later to you, Kip, and you can send it out. But one of the questions was just in around, there's a 6-month adaptation period. Is it true that there's a 6-month adaptation period in puberty for new bone and muscle length? And how do you address that with the athletes? I say yes, it is, that they're with that growth spurt in that stage. A lot of things are happening with the tendons and the ligaments, and then the adaptations of the bone growth. So how do you address that? I think at that point it is being, like I said earlier, just being careful with what you're doing with them at that time frame. So knowing when they're in that stage and understanding what risks you can and can't take. So if it is a matter of like they're in that phase, maybe they might be at a higher risk for different types of injuries because of that growth, whether it's the bone or muscle changing or tendons changing. So essentially just having a grasp on that and being able to train those areas a little bit. So like I said, just taking them back to the basics of training those movements a little bit more.
And they are checking on us.
I think that's, I'm not sure if anyone else has anything.
Can I do a step on to that question?
I feel like the next time you come to your border, you tell them I went for work.
There you go. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Sco.
So because of the age group, the U16 that I'm dealing with, and that question was posed by me about the growth spurts. And with that 6-month adaptation, so if you've got an athlete that has gone through the spurt during the summertime, that obviously is going to impact their winter. So, and you address the physical part of it. So I've had previously where an athlete the year before was like top level kind of thing, always podiumed, et cetera, Then through the summertime, before the next season, he went through that growth spurt and struggled like crazy for the next season, no podiums, et cetera, because he hadn't fully adapted yet. So there's the physical part of how do you deal with it, but there's also the psychological part of how you deal with that. And that's, do you have any input on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. And I mean, I can't speak too much on the mental side of that, but I can say like one thing would be educating the athletes that this is going to happen, and for them to understand that and understand that it's okay to take a step back in some ways to re-educate themselves. And I know that's tough a lot of times for athletes when they're in groups training and being able to take that step back and understand that that's okay to do that, and that it's going to make them better. I think is a big part of that mental side of things, that they don't want to miss out and they think they're better or further along than they are. And then this kind of a growth spurt happens and pushes them backwards. So I think just working on a big thing would be working with someone on those, like you said, the mental side of it, and being comfortable with understanding that why that's happening. And it doesn't necessarily mean they're not a good athlete. It's just their body is changing and how they need to adapt to those changes.
So at that point, then you do go back to the basics for the physical part of it to reintroduce them to.
Yeah, it's almost like reintroducing them to those very basic skills and movements within their new body, let's say.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Mel, I don't know if you guys can hear me or not.
Yep.
Okay. I just typed it in here, but over the last 6 weeks of, or well, 6 weeks, I guess 6 weeks since we've been able to do workouts, really, we've really been trying to hit sort of aerobic capacity in the field workouts, and we also had lots of chats on functional movement. sort of mobility type stuff. Do you want to talk some of the philosophy? I really think this is an understated part of our sport. You know, the power and the strength, I think at older age groups seems to not be prioritized, but get that, you know, people understand that. But I think sort of you want to talk a little bit about your philosophy and approach on creating the aerobic capacity and then sort of power and some of the anaerobic work. And then also on the functional and mobility movements. I mean, I can give my perspectives on it, but you're leading us on this. So.
Yeah, so like Cam said, during this time, and I think it offered actually us a pretty good opportunity with COVID right now, not with just Alpine, but a lot of sports, is being able to take a step back from the strength component of things with not having as much resources in terms of weights and whatnot, and really taking a step to that functional movement stuff that I talked about of the activation work, the functional movement stuff, and the aerobic capacity and anaerobic kind of that power speed work that Cam's touching on is what we've tried to do with the group is change their mindset of it's not just about the strength and power in the sport, but if the athletes can't withstand a full training camp in terms of fatigue levels, their performance and their skill levels are going to go down. So if we can get the athletes to be working hard, pushing each other in their aerobic and anaerobic work, they're going to be able to train harder, whether it's in the weight room or on snow in terms of training, and you're going to be able to do higher workload and higher levels of that ski training, and be able to go through multiple different, I know there's a ton of travel involved in skiing internationally. So not only are you looking at the travel and what that puts on your body, but also the multiple competitions, back-to-back competitions. So having that aerobic and anaerobic base under the athletes is what we're trying to educate them is if you can have that, you're going to be a step ahead when you get into the gym and when you get onto the mountain for that background. But the functional movement side of things is I've touched on a little bit in terms of like the mobility work. If we can get them to stay on top of mobility and the functional movement where it's a daily habit for them, they're going to be able to push more strength, more power in the gym, and then on the snow as well, they're going to be able to do a lot more. So that's kind of the focus that we've taken with them, and Cam's done a great job of being able to lead that in the field.
And you know, I think the only piece I would chime in on that is we've been really fortunate to have a great working relationship with Mel, but we are seriously pushing our athletes right now in sort of the aerobic realm in our field workouts. That we've just gotten back into the gym here this week for sort of our guys have had lifting workouts to do at home. Some have been using textbooks and book bags. Others have pretty complete gyms, but the fitness side is we are really pushing it right now. And I think it's probably one of the most undervalued pieces in skiing in my approach, or not in my approach, but in my experience. So I would encourage people at all levels, just because gyms are closed doesn't mean we can't get really quality gains. And then the mobility and the functional work with the athletes that we work with, sort of 17 to 19 years old, is a huge piece as they're putting on that muscle and, you know, a quality of movement. We're continuing to coach big time on not just do the work, but do the work really well. So thanks for all your work on that, Mel.
It is tough, though, I would say, when you have an athlete who is where they think they want to reach where the other athletes are in terms of their functional kind of movements. And so some athletes are progressing, some aren't. So that's where it is tough, but it's just educating the athletes to kind of take a step back when we're not reaching those the movement patterns we want to be doing. So
And I think this might be a good time in terms of messaging, because those are, from both of you guys, those are really good points. That we had our meeting with our high performance athletes, that's U16, 19, and Ontario ski team, I think last week, and some of the words that we're using that I also mostly showed up in this presentation, but it is largely about their ability to train and make the most of training, maximize time on snow, ski as much volume as we can safely and effectively, and then just handle the general workload. And so we use the terms work capacity, which is ability to get up at 5 a.m, walk to the gondola and just do everything they need to do in a day, or maybe handle a 10-day race series or multiple months or weeks on the road. So that general being able to tolerate the lifestyle, and then work training capacity, so ability to maximize training without breaking down and make the most of it, to have as many runs as they can without either putting themselves at risk or just performing poorly. And then durability is another term we use, these three, which means that their movement patterns are correct, they're as balanced as we can get them, they're as stable as we can get them, so they have correct movement patterns and good technique both on and off the hill, so they can handle as much as we can throw at them safely and well. And then we get into the things about performance, like strength, power, and what they need, but really it's getting them going through the early years to be able to make the most of their training and skiing and learning as a general philosophy with Alpine Ontario.
And I would throw it out to the group that unfortunately on our gym work right now, due to our limitations around group size, we can't really have outside people around. But in some of our field work, if anybody wants to come out and see sort of some of the work we're doing, I think we could easily handle one, maybe two coaches. We're doing morning workouts here in Collingwood if you wanted to come see our crew sprint up and down a field. If anybody wants to come check it out, and I'm sure we could figure that out on a case-by-case basis.
And I think a good resource right now too is if you're not sure in terms of, I know I talked a lot about the movement patterns and jumping and landing, and if you see an athlete you're not really sure, you can always take like videos of the athletes. That's one thing that we've been able to do a little bit too, is just take a video of them, send it to someone you might know, whether it's you're working with someone at Active Life, or being able to show them at some point when you're going into working with a strength coach, or even if someone has a medical therapy team, anything like that. Like if you have resources around to be able to reach out and take those videos and show them and say, hey, what can I do, or what cues can I as a coach say to this athlete to fix some of these things.
Well, thanks very much, Mel. We've run over, but it shows everyone's engaged, and I think you covered some great stuff. And thanks very much for all your work and for joining us.
No problem. Yeah, thanks everyone. I just mentioned here too on the screen, but CSI Ontario does have an open resource hub. So if you go to that website there, you can access quite a bit of information and different things from strength training, nutrition, mental performance. There's a ton of, whether it's videos, some of it is articles or presentations. So go ahead and take a look at those.